start the next session, I have one announcement. The first thing is somebody left the telephone in the hallway. If anybody phone will leave it here to pick it up. Second thing is we forgot to, not to acknowledge, but to talk about it a little bit, about Third World Quarterly, Third World Foundation work on anti-apartheid and its involvement. Therefore, I mean, the person behind it is with us here. And therefore, I'm going to give the floor to Shahid to say a word or not. He's filming me, but I think he cannot film himself. Shahid, please come and tell us about the famous prize you gave.
Yes, I think for those who don't know, I began life at Third World Quarterly when it first began in 1978. And soon afterwards, the charitable foundation which had brought it about was also well endowed, and they started to announce prizes for people who'd contributed to the Third World. And I believe the start was made by, well, the names that we know connected with Africa. Bob Geldof got it, but most importantly, I think Winnie and Nelson Mandela in 1985 were awarded $100,000 US dollars. That was the biggest prize at the time, more than Nobel. And the prize was handed over by Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia at the time, to Oliver Tambo, who then gave a lecture, which has been reproduced in the journal Third World Quarterly, calling itself the Third World Lecture. So that continued for a while. And in 1989, I think the last prize was given to Desmond Tutu. So there is a long association of the journal with anti-apartheid. Yeah.
Thank you, Shahid. I leave the floor to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Bennett. A very good afternoon to you all, and a big thank you to the speakers of this morning's session and to our keynote, Nomboniso Gasa, and also just mindful we've got online participants as well, so very good to have you joining us virtually. And I think our discussions thus far with the provocations of the various speakers and contributions from the floor have really provided a great bedrock and also a set of productive disruptions for the continuing conversations. So just to very briefly introduce myself, I am Janet Remington. I am a global portfolio director in the humanities, media and the arts, and also more broadly across the social sciences, working for Routledge, Taylor and Francis. I also have the honor of being a research associate at WITS in the School of Literature, Language and Media, and also in the University of York in the UK. And it's great to be back, I must say, in my hometown, especially during Jacaranda season, and the opportunity to reconnect and with colleagues, contacts, and to make a whole set of new networks through this event and other conversations happening this week. So this session today focuses on research and scholarship, which of course informs policy and practice. And at its best, it engages more widely with the broader community. And so what we've done is to gather together a really strong, fascinating panel of editors in various capacities, working across publications, both in the academic environment and also journalistic. And so I'll go on to introduce them shortly. All of these publications are based on the continent, mostly in South Africa, but also with other editorial colleagues based in other parts of Africa, and many of which are also associated with a number of institutions, institutes, and learned societies. So I was just reflecting that we've just had the Sunday Times Literary Awards, where the keynote speaker was Justice Edwin Cameron, formerly of the Constitutional Court, and he was reflecting on a number of aspects of democracy, and just highlighting two which are really pertinent to our discussions today: the free press and also independent research. And of course, absolutely central to any democracy, and and mostly in place in South Africa today, although they are under various forms of pressure. Also, just to speak very briefly about, just a reminder that we have two really exciting local bookshop partners who are outside, Book Circle Capital and Lit Culture Books, who've put in a wonderful array of titles out there for people to browse. And so do go out and support these local outfits, which do a great job in convening community. And also we have a Routledge Taylor and Francis table. Sam and Corsi, our marketing managers outside, if you'd like to go and have a chat with him and pick up some materials to find out more about how to submit to the journals, and also some more about the book series that Beth and Abebe introduced us to this morning. So now briefly to turn to the introductions in our panel. I'll just keep them very short in the interests of time, and I'm sure the editors themselves will pick up on various aspects of their own contexts as we go along. So maybe I'll start from the far end there with Jabulani Sikakane, who is the chief editor of The Conversation Africa. And then we've got Tarminda Kaur, editor, one of the editors of Anthropology Southern Africa. Ntaba Singh Motseme, representing Journal of Contemporary African Studies as editor. And we've got Lisa Otto, who is editor of African Security Review. Martha Bridgman of South African Journal of International Affairs. And last but not least, we have Kobani Kamela. Excuse me, I've had this terrible cold, and all my vocal apparatus isn't working 100%. So representing African Studies, one of the co-editors. And also Dina Lagaga, who's, I think we'd run out of chairs all next to each other. Dina Lagaga, of course, one of the wonderful co-editors of Eastern African Literary and Cultural Studies. And I think, yes, we can now hand over to the editors themselves. I think we've given them an almost impossible task in that we've pitched this session to be constructed in terms of giving lightning talks, very brief contributions, and then leaving plenty of time for audience participation, both in person here in the room and online. And so there are two aspects to the lightning talks, looking back and looking forward, essentially. So I've asked them if they can to reflect on some key developments, trends, and topics in their respective fields or publications of the past years, and then shifting emphasis to thoughts and provocations about where they think their field could or should be going and what they would like to see more of in their publications. So I will turn over to the panel. And yes, and then we, of course, will open it up to everyone. Thank you. Would you like to take the others?
Sure.
And I think we just need yes, unless we want to use the roving mic, up to you.
All right. Okay. No, I don't mind standing. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. As Janet has correctly said, my name is Tsobani. I'm here representing African Studies. I'm not alone. This was a collectively prepared reflection with my colleagues, many of whom couldn't be here today. So I'm relatively new to the role. I've only been the co-editor for a few months. But I've previously been the president of Anthropology Southern Africa, and we also oversee that journal. So in the past, I guess, 3-4 years, I've been very immersed into academic publishing. So I just only have 5 reflections. So hopefully I'll be able to get all of those in within 5 minutes. But just to introduce our journal. We are a top 15 journal of African studies we are a top 15 journal of African studies, and by focus, we're interdisciplinary. We're really interested in high quality, conceptual, empirical writing that is of relevance to Africa. We publish across disciplines, including anthropology, sociology, literary studies, media studies, geography, cultural studies, and many other fields. We're particularly interested in work that takes a critical approach, particularly in relation to race, gender, and sexuality, and various other social dynamics in Africa. We publish both established scholars as well as emerging scholars, particularly those who provide new critical, theoretical, and methodological paradigms. We have a very wide and diverse board, both in South Africa, in other African countries, as well as internationally. And we're really interested in interdisciplinary conversations that are from and about Africa. So my 5 reflections of things that I've observed over the years. The first one is, I don't think anyone who's been reading anything, you've been on social media, hasn't seen probably some of the jokes around academics becoming content creators for these big publishing companies. So point number 1 that I wanted to reflect on is we are starting to have a more critical take on the extractive forms of contemporary academic publishing companies. So we've seen a lot of backlash towards not just Taylor and Francis, but Elsevier and many of these publishing companies, as well as their extractive practices. So this has led to point reflection number 2, which is the reviewer crisis that many of us are starting to experience now. There's been a movement both within the academy and outside of the academy to resist this extraction and this capitalistic exploitation from these publishing houses. So now it's actually become very tough to find a lot of reviewers to be able to provide the checks and balances for the work that we publish. But despite this challenge around these extractive forms, as well as the movement of resisting doing free labor for these companies, we still adopted African studies as a developmental approach, particularly in relation to trying to get a lot of younger scholars to publish within the journal, but capacity is a huge issue. We get about nearly 400 submissions a year, and I think we take probably about 10% of those for our issues. So there's a huge capacity issue that we're not able to provide enough developmental capacity to be able to nurture new and emerging scholars. Point number 4, we also still see a lot of dominance of senior scholars who publish in the journal, and younger scholars are still not as represented as they could be in the journal. We've tried other approaches. We'll have 3 writing workshops next year. We have a number of prizes, such as the Vilakazi Prize. for writing on African studies, but despite this, it's still a glass half full. And then point number 5, we still see geographical dominance of South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And we still have over 50 other African countries that we don't receive a lot of submissions from. And then the last point I wanted to reflect on is also we still see what I call an Africa in crisis submissions. So a lot of the submissions that we often receive present Africa literally in crisis. So we don't always see a full spectrum of African issues represented. Issues of pleasure, desire, and so on often rarely ever show up in the kinds of submissions that we have. There's many other topics to reflect on that I won't go into, concerns around decolonizing the field of African studies, which can in many times be also dominated by scholars from the global north, even though these are journals that are supposed to center African realities. But for the interest of time, I think I'll stop with those 5 or 6 key points. I thank you for your time.
Hi, I'm Martha Bridgman, and I am the editor of the South African Journal of International Affairs, which is associated with the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIA, known to many. It's on the Wits campus, and yet I'm from Cape Town, so that's just a bit of background. SAGIA, as I refer to this journal, works really at the interface between academia, and hopefully therefore theory, Gustavo, and policy. The Institute is a policy research institute. It is the audience for the journal, as well as most of the Institute's outputs, would be policymakers on the African continent. The reflections that I would have from the past few years, actually 30 years, I'm not sure, yes. We started in 1993. So that is when the journal started. I have not been there since then, but having looked back, I can say that SAIA's work was very much trying to grapple with the implications of the democratic transition in South Africa and what that meant for not only South Africa's new role in the world post-94, but also its relationship on the African continent with other states. And so the challenge of settling into this community of African states, including SADC, was a focus of several articles. Then it looked at many of the developments through the 90s when there was considered to be a democratic ascendancy post-Cold War. But of course, we know then what happened in 2001 and the 9/11 sort of unleashing of the war on terror and what that has meant for the African continent. That was a big focus. And I think an inflection point, I know that might be one of those words that's being bandied about far too much, was the NATO invasion of Libya and what that meant for the AU and the responsibility to protect and that whole new approach that the AU was trying to roll out in the early 2000s, from the early 2000s taking over from the OAU. And so that was a big focus in the journal. It has also looked at the agency of Africa within bodies like the G20, COP, and the whole climate change negotiations, and other forums such as IBSA from 2003, rarely mentioned these days, but also, of course, now BRICS. And South Africa's been a member since 2011, and I'm sure people are aware of the recent summit. That has been, in fact, it's the subject of a special issue that Gustavo and I are working on, looking at the implications of the expansion of BRICS for the global order. Renewed challenges in an era of democratic recession, that formed a focus in the most recent period. I want to just mention, I've heard quite a bit about elections, and elections are not the be-all and the end-all, But we did a special issue with the IEC at the end of last year looking at safeguarding election monitoring bodies the world over. They were the rotating chair of the Association of World Election Bodies. And that was a significant timing. You would all be aware of the fact that this year, of course, elections have happened in, I've read between 60 and 80 countries. It's a bit contested information, but a large percentage, at least 50% of the world's population live in those countries. And so that was an important input we felt. Where should the field of international affairs be going? Just 3 points. Increased emphasis and support to support first-time scholars from Africa, Global South. This does take time. It takes a lot of time to just work with and mentor, but that would be a priority, to remove barriers to knowledge production and dissemination from the Global South. More work published on women in IR. I am trying very hard. There's a special issue on digital pathways to peace in Africa, and that is such an evident way for women to become involved. It removes many barriers for travel, barriers in so many ways for women's input into their country's foreign policies, but also just international issues, climate change, peacekeeping, global health, the many issues that are transnational. And then one practical suggestion, we have done virtual special issues, which are now called collections on the Taylor and Francis website, where they pull papers from past issues that would be useful as context setting, often ahead of meetings. So for instance, the BRICS meetings, we had a series of papers that we could present, which we pulled together, and that was on the site. We also did one on climate matters to celebrate. SAIA is turning 90 this year, so it's an institute with a history. That was pulling papers from the last 10 years ahead of the COP meetings that just happened. So I think that's an excellent sort of service, pulls together research around a subject, because we don't always have themed issues. We do a lot of regular issues in order to accommodate the upcoming African scholars who are seeking to just get their research published.
Okay, so on to the African Security Review. I've been with the African Security Review since 2018, co-editing alongside my colleague, Prof. Dries Veldhuizen from UNISA. And it's certainly been an interesting experience, I think also from a journal management perspective, and how we've aimed to kind of improve the things that people such as yourselves in the room who submit to journals are concerned about, like turnaround times and how long it takes to get your reviews back and things like that. But I would also echo the comment that we are beholden to reviewers and their ability to participate, their willingness to participate, and also the speed with which they see fit to do that. In fact, I think one of the big challenges is actually even just getting a response from peer reviewers, and that sometimes you'll have to ask up to 12 or 13 people to get 2 responses for a single paper. But I get ahead of myself, so let me just introduce the journal briefly. This journal actually finds its origins also in a think tank, with the African Security Review having been a product of the Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria. I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any researcher at the ISS today who knows, actually, that this journal has its origins there, but it's still something, interestingly, that we keep as part of our marketing, even though the journal largely belongs to Taylor and Francis now. We publish broadly on what the title says, African security, and so really any topics, multidisciplinary even, that deal with traditional and non-traditional threats to security, as well as human security. Human security is kind of the touchstone for the ISS, and so was also really the touchstone for this journal. We get an inordinate amount of submissions from Nigeria. We probably get more submissions from Nigeria than from everywhere else put together. And whilst this is wonderful to see this kind of rich scholarship that's coming out of Nigeria in particular, it does also present a challenge in trying to put out issues that are balanced and that are showing voices from all around the continent on a variety of different topics. And so because we received this kind of quite large set of submissions from Nigeria, you can probably imagine some of the topics that we receive frequent content on. Boko Haram, a lot of stuff on that, and terrorism broadly speaking. Banditry, cattle rustling, more recently, things like the NSAS protests, policing during COVID-19, these have been some things that we've really seen a lot of content coming through on. Interestingly, however, you'll see that while we have really good readership on the African continent, our readership actually, this research really is reaching people in the likes of the United States, the UK, big audience for us there, as well as some other selected places in the West, broadly speaking. So I think that that's also quite an interesting dynamic. So when you look at our downloads, we certainly get a lot of downloads coming from from South Africa and then from other kind of hubs within the continent like Kenya, but definitely quite a significant readership in the West, so to speak. So I think that that's also quite an interesting dynamic. And so in terms of where I would like to see things in terms of the submissions that we receive to the journal going forward is really just diversity. So I think we do a reasonably good job in publishing a balance in terms of the scholars themselves. So you'll often find emerging scholars, well-established big names, so that there's quite a good cross-section, I think, publishing in the journal. But what we're struggling with a little bit more is really just getting content that represents the diversity of security, discussions, dialogue, issues, debate across the continent. So, for example, we would not have published anything on, like North Africa. We get very, very little that comes from North Africa. Even the Great Lakes, not so much coming in from there. We've had some quite interesting things recently, I think, coming from South Africa. Also, looking at dynamics between Eritrea and Ethiopia, things like that. Of course, a lot of interest in Al-Shabaab in Mozambique. But I think that there's so much else happening on the continent, and even at the AU level or at the regional level where these challenges are being dealt with, there's not enough scholarship, at least coming to our journal, on those issues. So I think there really is a lot of scope. There's a lot of scope for really bringing special issues to the journal in order to be able to spotlight certain issues that are just not getting airplay in the way that they should be. And then I think the final point that I'd like to make, to just echo some of the comments that have come before, is that really academic publishing is a circular economy. To the extent of it being extractive, I wouldn't necessarily disagree. I got a royalty check for a book that was published 4 years ago to the grand total of €45. So ensure that I don't spend it all in one place. But on a more serious note, if you're submitting to a journal, and I have this experience myself where I've waited a year for peer review, and I'm sure that that's not an unusual experience for people in the room, is that ultimately, if you are a scholar who wants to publish, and indeed who has to publish, because it's publish or perish, right? Then you have to also form part of the circular economy by providing peer review, by accepting invitations to sit on editorial boards, and then actually being present once you're there. Because oftentimes these editorial boards are just kind of like, it's like a glorified prize to say that you've made it in your field by being recognized. But having an active editorial board can actually be really, really useful as well. So I think I'll leave it there for my reflections. Thanks.
Afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here. I'm the journal editor of the Journal for Contemporary African Studies. This journal is also it started in the 1980s. I am the first, African woman journal editor. And I think that's important to say, not because of, you want to clap for, okay. It's important to mention, because I think that's one of my first major points I was going to make at the end, but let me make it now, that we have just far too, particularly African women, black women, who are journal editors globally, in Taylor and Francis, and in other journal outfits. And let me leave it there. I'll pick up on that later. Let me talk a little bit about JCAS. So JCAS, as I said, was started in the 80s. It's actually housed in the Institute for Social and Economic Research, ISA, which is Rhodes University. It's very broad. So as you can hear by the name, the journal name itself, we focus on key developments and debates in Africa. We accept manuscripts from across the humanities and social sciences in almost all the areas: culture, development, education, labor, land, political economy, gender, environmental questions. So it makes, kind of holding the journal together quite a difficult task in itself. We face the same challenges that we do. We get a huge number of submissions from particular regions on the continent, particularly West Africa, and specifically Nigeria, and specifically Southern Africa, and specifically South Africa. We're seeing a rise, we're seeing kind of a growth within East Africa, particularly Ethiopia and Kenya. But I would definitely say sort of the predominant regions are those two. So that's something to look out for which I'm very conscious of, that I also would like to shift in terms of having more equity in continental representation, particularly the Great Lakes. I've also been, looking into that as well, and seeing how we can, incorporate it more in the journal, and also have creative ways of dealing with translation, because that's usually what, we get, it's the issue of translation. In terms of, the disciplinary orientation and the thematic focus, historically, or maybe it's in the past decade or so, of the articles, I've been a journal editor since late 2022. I joined around August 2022. And what I've seen is that there's a huge sort of, disciplinary orientation, a political economy orientation in the journal. And so, and a very structural approach, what I will term a structural approach to the journal. My wish list, how should we shift and turn? I think, obviously, it's the whole, I think the journal needs to be more reflective of the shifting global political landscape, the shifting geopolitical landscape, so more South-South sort of orientated, looking at those global political and economic relations, BRICS obviously being a major one, the diaspora, Africa, how Africa relates to the diaspora, how Africa relates to the rest of the BRICS countries. And there was a special focus this morning on South America, which I also have a particular interest of Africa and South American sort of interest. Of course, China. We get a lot of submissions that do look at sort of, at that particular relationship as well. As well as we tend to be, what we, as the journals that are submitting, interestingly enough, we're not looking at the sort of, the radical shifts that are happening in the political economy of Africa in itself. So we get quite very, some of the times you think that scholars and thinkers are not in touch with the radical shifts that are happening politically in terms of, post-liberation movements, what was spoken to about this morning, shifting liberation, national liberation movement, political parties around the continent, systems, regional integration. So we're not getting current knowledges that's really dealing on the edge of the questions that we're dealing with right now, and the nature of new conflicts. We tend to be reproducing sort of the same kinds of understanding African conflicts on the continent. Another one that I'd like us to see, for me, that I'm particularly focused on, obviously my own part, is the sociology of knowledge, really focusing on introducing what someone earlier on called counter ecologies, the indigenous knowledge system, alternative knowledge production histories, centering the knowledge production of the South, centering African scholars in their work. We hope we're doing a special issue next year on Professor Ben Magubane, who, by the way, is still not taught in sociology classes in South Africa. It's just, anyway. Let's leave it there. So really, yeah, introducing, kind of contesting, what was the sort of Euro-American dominance that still persists, and challenging some of those assumptions in knowledge production. And as I say, that's something I'm looking closely at and really in the journal hoping to engage with. The other issue, of course, is South-South migration. We receive very little work on migration, which is quite interesting, particularly South-South migration, migration within Africa, the continent itself, migration. We see it at a very local level now in the townships, the tensions, of South-South migration, and we don't have the theoretical frames to actually deal with what's happening as well. So that's something I'm, really interested as well in focusing on, are those challenges and how they filter at very local levels as well. We tend to, I think one of the speakers was talking about how we use northern theories on migration. So we need to develop, I'd like to see that space being encouraged of us theorizing South-South migration. Another one that I'm particularly interested in, because it deals, along the work that I focus on, is the rise of informality, tin cities, informal settlements rather, what we call black geographies, where black people live and call home, townships, shanty towns, etc., huge shanty towns in Kenya, and I don't receive work on this. I mean, it really it's quite alarming to me. I receive very little work as well, focusing on areas such as townships, informal settlements, and this is where predominantly the black, poor, and working class live. So really also looking to grow that. And of course, I won't speak to the environmental challenges. I think as in the African continent, I'm quite interested in more the sort of theoretical contributions that we can make. I have a colleague, Trevor Ngwane, he talks about, energy racism. So these are the kinds of terms that I think in terms of producing knowledge production around these issues of water, energy crisis as well. And and then I'll leave it at that. The running thread perhaps is to talk about that. So it's really a critical reflection on South-South, indigenization, decolonization, questions of working class knowledges, intersectionality. It really runs a thread along those lines. And again, I would concur with others around diversity as well, but principally questions of diversifying knowledge production. Thanks.
May I start? Hi, good afternoon. My name is Dharminder, and I am co-editor of Anthropology Southern Africa. Today I represent my colleagues and Andrew Muggsy Spiegel, Leah Jonk, Afua Para, and Hamida Parker. So it's 5 of us who are on the editorial collective, who look at the submissions day in, day out, as they come, as we accept and reject, and do all sorts of circus around the journal. Yeah, this is a bit too high for me. Excuse me. Okay. So anthropology. As you already know, it carries the burden of acknowledging its complicity in the colonial past and present, as if physics and chemistry are not colonial disciplines and have nothing to do with colonial harms. But I leave that in bracket. So Anthropology Southern Africa, and for short, we call it ASNA, as we know it today, is a product of contestations between many different ideas. So then the journal itself was first launched in 1978 as South African Journal of Anthology. At that time, most of the publications were in Afrikaans, and it was largely the Volkenkunde side of anthropology. So basically, what basically did was provided scientific support to apartheid ideology of separate development. So for those who don't know what Volkenkunde is, just very briefly, and it is a caricature partly to make you laugh. So social anthropologists, what they do is they make familiar strange and strange familiar. What Volkenkunde did was make strange stranger and aggrandize familiar, make it shine even higher, the familiar. So that was basically what Volkenkunde was doing, and creating a really excellent archive of what you call the racist theorization. So it's all there to be critiqued and proven how poor it was in understanding how human societies work. So by 2002, the journal is rebranded as what we know, Anthropology Southern Africa, and it is a product of those contestations between social anthropologists and Volkenkunde, the aggrandization of whatever was the powers may be, the governing elite of South Africa. Right, so it was kind of a point of victory, but it wasn't celebrated as such for the social anthropologists. It was more about critique and struggle and further contestations. In 2002, the journal is still published by the society itself. So its international imprint is almost negligible. Even between 1978 and 2002, the international footprint is almost negligible, as large number of publications are in Afrikaans, and at the time at least 1/3 of publications came from government offices. So basically work which was to prove the ideological concerns of the time. And most of the social anthropologists basically did not publish in this journal because of their reservation with this kind of spoofy science. 2014 is the first time that journal is co-published with Taylor and Francis and NISC, and it begins to get some recognition in international circles. So I first enter the scene of Anthropology Southern Africa in 2017, when, as an aspiring South African anthropologist, this is the first journal I would have liked to, and in the end published my first paper in. But since being part of the journal, I'm also kind of surprised to see the damaging impact of the structural and status pressures that researchers of my generation face. And what is that damaging impact? Basically, all South African publications get these brownie points by DHAT and funding. And what it does is it says, you publish research and we'll pay you. Don't worry about actually doing the research, right? Because there's very little funding that goes around to actually conduct meaningful long-term ethnographic research. So what I joined ASNA as a co-editor last year, October, and obviously I'm reading the journal, but now I'm looking at it from the inside, and the kind of papers we receive can be best defined as coming out of fear. They're not confident. They just want to get published. We give them critical feedback. They say, yes, yes, that's great. They fix it. They don't say, hey, that's not even my argument. Why are you doing this? So there has been no real conversation, which in my head, when I become aspiring academic, is what journals did. They provided a platform to have critical conversation. The structures basically killed that conversation in this madness to be published. And as the scholars become more established, of course they wouldn't want to publish in a South African-based journal, they would want to publish in an international-based journal. But the actual the soul of what this work should be is generating conversation hasn't been happening for at least 2017-18. There have been some moments when that conversation happens, and what has been so good about the journal is that they have published those debates. And we would still like to publish those debates where somebody publishes something and then another group of scholars say, hey, that's nonsense, and they publish something else, and then somebody else publishes. And that kind of tussle, and that battle of intellectual ideas is not as dominant in my generation, my present time. So when Janet asked us, okay, thoughts and provocations about where we are going, so here are some thoughts, some provocations rather. So the publishing landscape today, as we know it, is changing really, really fast. But like TNF, Taylor and Francis, parent body Informa, basically signed a contract with AI generative models to help develop AI using the research content. I do not say this as a critique. I say this, we have no clue what this is going to do. And I do not know, at least from anthropology perspective, who's actually doing the anthropological research into what these changes, these AI language models are going to do, how we read, write, and think. If I had a wishful thinking around what this, if I could be just an optimist and what they would do, I wish what they would do is this kind of, the papers we get which are just perfect language-wise, and they end the conversation, they have covered all their literature, they've made the argument, they've proven some theory which has been there for 100 years, again through their ethnography, and rearranged some theoretical arguments which you can neither reject nor feel enthusiastic about. Maybe they'll become less useful, and maybe we'll return where slow production of knowledge will become more important and the ideas will become more important. Every time the authorities maybe in my university ask how many brownie points, how many units, outputs have you published? I wish they'll come back and ask me, what's your new idea? How are you making sense of the world? And how are you teaching? So that's my wishful thinking, that our journal will move in that direction, wishful thinking. But don't say no, say yes, you're the academics, it's in us, right? If we can push that change, maybe through research. So I suppose, so that's my provocation to all of us. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Jabulani Skakane from the Conversation Africa. I've got 2 points to talk to. One is about the state of universities, because obviously that has huge implications for what we do at the Conversation, because we get authors from universities, either based on the expertise that people have built up teaching or the expertise that they build through the research track. Historically, the problem with African universities is that you've got almost 3 tiers, if I could put it that way. Those that were doing very well before '94 have continued to do very well. Those that were obviously became known as historically disadvantaged universities because they were in the homelands, most of them have done very badly, so they continue to do very badly. Then there's something in the middle, some that kind of either have got what you would call centers of excellence, in the sense that there is a unit within a university that does very well, but the university overall is maybe struggling, right? So that situation, if one tries to project forward, is going to get worse because of cutbacks from government. In other words, direct transfers to universities have been cut quite significantly if you look, if you take a 10, 13-year view, because government took a view that it wanted to transfer money directly to NSFAS to increase the student population at universities, but doesn't give universities money to increase the teaching capacity, in other words, at universities, right? Now, if you look at what has happened with public universities throughout the continent, the outcome of that is going to be obviously, is quite dire. Obviously, what you produce as a university, the quality will decline. But also what it does, particularly if I apply it to our own circumstances, is that people who teach at universities suddenly don't have time to do anything else. I had one anecdotal experience with an academic I was trying to recruit in one of the African countries in the East, who said to me, look, I teach 3 classes a day. By the time taking traffic into account, because these 3 classes he teaches them at 3 different universities just to keep his head above the water. By the time I get home, I don't have time to write anything. Secondly, you guys don't pay. You're expecting me to do this work during my evening, and you're not going to pay me. So if, sorry, I'll rather do something that's going to bring me additional income. So it means if we continue down this path that South Africa is pursuing in terms of managing its public finances and then how you finance universities, you're going to get to that stage where you have people who just don't have time either to do research or to write anything, basically, because they are busy teaching, right? So that's one problem. But the other one, which has become much more prevalent across the rest of the continent, is that research starts moving out of universities into independent or kind of research centers that are set up outside of universities. They get donor funding. So research doesn't get done within a university, which has its own implications, because there ought to be kind of this infusion or this exchange between the research side of the university and what gets taught, right? And secondly, universities produce knowledge, public knowledge in a particular sense, right? Now, if that knowledge is being produced by independent research institutions, who owns it, and where does it belong in that public education kind of sphere? So that's one set of problems that I think we've been dealing with. That will probably get worse, that I think will get worse going forward. The second one is got to do with technology. I mean, the changes or the advances or rapid advances in technology. My colleague here has kind of touched a little bit on it. Everybody, obviously, I mean, for reasons that maybe there's a lot of money that's looking at artificial intelligence, everybody's talking about it because probably private sector guys want to know what's going to happen with artificial intelligence and how it can be used for all manner of things, either to cut costs, increase productivity, reduce labor, because if you're running a business, particularly in South Africa, you don't want to deal with labor issues. So if there's technology that can do all of these things for you and you don't have to hire people, you know, all the better. But for us in particular, who are in publishing, technology comes with benefits and problems, or challenges rather, right? Benefits could be around issues of productivity. Like if you take the Conversation Africa, for example, or the Conversation platform globally, when we get an article for an academic, we will ask for links to a source document for any statement of fact that is made in the article. Now, some academics don't have the time to supply us with those links, and we try and generate them, right, and look for them, right? So it's something that, depending on the complexity of the article, that process of looking for those links can take anything up to, well, between 20 and 40 minutes. Now, there's some experimentation with artificial intelligence that's being done, I think, in other parts of the world, particularly in America, where you could use AI to generate those links. However, you still need a human eye at this stage to verify whether those links are correct. So potentially then you can reduce that time for looking for those links down to 20%, to 20 minutes, and that because that's the human eye just checking if the links are correct, but the artificial intelligence sort of has found them for you. Then the other area where you could use artificial intelligence beneficially is all our photographs that we publish them with a description of what the photograph is about. This is meant as help for people who kind of got visually impaired people. So you describe what the photograph is about. Potentially, you could use technology to read the photograph and describe it. However, you still need human eyes just to verify that that description is accurate, because the way technologies work, that could be wrong. But there are other potential problems that arise with technology. I mean, all of the descriptions of AI, because most of what people are talking about with artificial intelligence is stuff that actually nobody knows how it's going to pan out. It's still way out there in the future. I mean, there's basic AI, like if you use, you can talk to Alexa, or kind of when you're driving, there's a lady who's giving you instructions and gets very irritated if you don't take the left turn. So there's a form of artificial intelligence, but kind of fairly rudimentary. And what people are talking about is obviously something way into the future, and we don't know what that's going to look like and how it's going to behave. Everybody is experimenting about what it might look like, right? But that could potentially come with a lot of problems, as we have seen with algorithms. Like, for example, they look at what sort of articles you search for. Suddenly, you can't see anything else, and then you develop political tunnel vision, because what gets delivered to you by an electronic platform kind of only gives you kind of that small slice of the world around you, and you see nothing else. And suddenly you can't interact with fellow citizens or fellow human beings, because you're only reading potentially maybe even less than 3% of what's out there, because that's what the technology delivers for you. So that's a problem with technology. Then there's a myriad of other problems, I think, with technology. They potentially biases. Algorithms, in fact, have been found out that they have certain attitudes depending on how they were coded and all of that. So those are the problems, I think, that arise with technology. So those are for us. Those are the two major problems that we foresee. The decline hopefully doesn't get that bad in the state of universities because of the funding issues, and then secondly, what comes with technology, advances in technology, because technology, effectively, even for us at the moment, it's getting worse with the Google algorithm, which determines when you search, for example, for information about a particular topic, which are the articles that pop up first. And then, therefore, that's what you have access to. So that might get worse in the future, creating all of these problems that I was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, colleagues. I was nodding quite vigorously at some of the things that were being said because I recognized them. And also, having been an editor at African Studies, I could hear some of the things you were talking about. Anyway, thank you so much for inviting me here. I am the Anomaly. My journal, I'm currently at the Eastern African Literary and Cultural Studies. And I'm sure you're all asking, what has that got to do with South Africa? It has everything to do with South Africa. I co-edit the journal alongside my colleagues, Tina Steiner, who's at Stellenbosch University, Linda Spencer, who's at Rhodes University, and Godwin Siundu, who is at the University of Nairobi. It's a peer-reviewed and accredited journal, which means South African scholars are very welcome to submit their literary and cultural work to us. In other words, we don't have restrictions when it comes to the location from which the literature and the cultural studies or pieces of work come from, although we want to, it is a way of developing scholarship from the Eastern African region. And as we have picked up from conversations before, Eastern Africa has not been as aggressive in terms of production of knowledge as other areas, especially Southern and Western Africa. This is a relatively new journal, launched in 2013, first publication issue out in 2014. I only joined in 2019, I think. 2018, 2019. And the aim for this was, of course, to kind of create an avenue to grow the scholarship from the Eastern African region, and also to get it into conversation with Southern Africa, and especially South Africa, and you'll see how that connection comes in. And this is, so we broadly publish traditionally papers that are traditionally literary, but also about cultural studies. I am the cultural studies leg of this journal, given that I'm in media studies and cultural studies. And so that can be as broad as we can make it. It is important to note that the journal is as a consequence of South African training and scholarship. All 4 editors were trained here in South Africa, whether it's WITS, UCT, Stellenbosch, including the very 2 founding editors, Tom Odhiambo, whom some of you might recognize, and Godwin Siundu, who was also trained at WITS. And the journal is then about the evidence of how South Africa is germinating onto the continent. So completely, I'm turning around a conversation that Divine was speaking about earlier, because it is about the ways in which South Africa is germinating into the continent and opening itself up to a new terrain of audiences, right? It is important to note that this journal is one that enters into South African knowledge system through collaboration. And this is quite important because it's about making something new possible, right? It's about collaboration, it's about expansions, and it's about getting into new territories. And just as a way of locating or identifying or further emphasizing this point, I'm just thinking about a point that Nomboniso Gasa made earlier today, where she spoke about this identity, this thing called African, and the ways in which that was politically maneuvered and taken away. And what does it mean to be a South African who's also an African? And these are the ways in which we think about, theoretically at least, we think about entering into that conversation. So that where the journal is then earmarked Eastern Africa, meaning that it includes or takes in work from Ethiopia, and Abebe would know because he's on the board. I don't know if you know that you are. Sudan, Somalia, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Burundi, Malawi. We have published work from South Africa. I'm proud to say that. And West Africa, Nigeria, Ghana. So the point of the journal, and what I feel passionate and my contribution to the journal is that we are about holding space for African scholars. We are about encouraging budding authors. And so the idea of collaboration is about invitation at the same time. We do enter into these kinds of conversations quite practically with sister journals, such as Journal of African Cultural Studies. I know Kali Kutsie is somewhere online. Hi, Kali. We enter into these kinds of conversations. We also enter into conversations with conference organizers, and in our case, we have tended to carry out parallel sessions with emerging scholars, where we have mentorship sessions at these conferences, and where we encourage the presenters to develop their papers for publication. All right, so I'll finish by saying that when it comes to the provocation, mine is about time. The ideal element for me is, for productivity, is time, right? Can we enter into a conversation about slow work? And here I'm saying, think about the idea of the slow professor, the slow worker, right? And again, in conversation with what we were both raising, in a context where we are all on speed mode to get out, to get our work out there, to publish, can we slow down? Is there scope for this? A place in which multiple people enter into dialogue, whether it's authors, reviewers, editors, and even possibly audiences. How can we make this world happen? Yeah, that's me.
Right, okay, back on the mic, and we've got also mics that will be roving in the audience. Thank you so much to our panelists who've given us so much material, so many insights and contributions, many common themes, but also some characteristics of each journal that are distinctive to that particular publication. So I just also wanted to mention that we have another co-editor in the audience, Tula Simpson, of the South African Historical Journal, and also others. I'm sure there may be others that I'm not seeing online or with us today in person, but of course also many of you are on editorial boards. And also to mention our co-publishers who are our key partners, UNISA Press and NISC, and the many institutions, associations and societies that are part of the community and all contributing to the broader ecosystem of knowledge production and dissemination. So I'm going to hand over, we'll open it up to interactions among the panelists and also with the audience in person and online. I think I see a hand up there, many hands going up, so I think we'll take maybe 3 questions to start and then invite some responses.
I think it's important to contextualize why we have Taylor and Francis and UNISA and what it took to bring this together. I think one of the persons responsible is David Green, who came here as head of journal, global director of journals for Taylor and Francis. And I was at UNISA as a director, then Beth followed me. It was an incredible struggle when we started it. I think it's important to know that this didn't happen because there was this, the criticism we're receiving is very interesting. For instance, the anti-big companies now, especially Taylor and Francis and the other, the Dutch ones, etc. But I found myself producing journals which used to go to Michigan State University, and they were distributed, UNISA journals. They'll give us maybe $3 for each journal we gave. And when we negotiated, and actually again, there was some incredible leadership within UNISA, in particular Pani Pitiana, who signed in $1 million a year to get this going. I think there was equivalent from Taylor and Francis for that. I mean, there was, he saw the need to do that. He understood the need because, and then there was huge reaction, both from within South Africa editors. Here we sold out for the international corporate bodies. My argument was, my article is as good as what is published in Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard. So why should I get $5 for my journal? Speaking with the UNISA hat. It took a while for people to accept that. I think that's important. And the East African Journal is, yes, I'm a member, and actually I did a special issue She thinks I'm a sleeping member. That one was interesting because it was actually a contestation of what is published in the north and what should be published in the south. There was a British Eastern Africa journal run by a famous, then an Oxford academic, based in Nairobi and in the UK. And there was this young Kenyan graduate students at WITS who are interested in that. For I just told Janet and David, I said, we have to carry this. And that's what it did it. It's not either or. And then coming back again in terms of the international issue is two countries which actually tried to break from this international global publishing was Brazil and India. They put a lot of money when Lula was in power and when I don't want to mention the ANC in the sense, but when the Indian Congress were in power, they thought they would rule for 100 years, but that got stopped. That's another story. Both the Indian government and the Brazil government put a lot of money. Then in both countries, two right-wing governments came in, and they threw it away. Therefore, back to zero. For I think people should be very careful in, I'm not saying we should just go ahead with, my issue is it would be good to, to have alternative system like a government subsidy in South Africa does it in its own way. But my issue is that in the South, in Africa in particular, we tend to accept the left argument, we should not be doing anything. What it does to us is we become in the margin of Western production. I used to be a member of the many radical journals, including ROP. Okay? ROP is really a Leeds organization, Leeds, Northern England, and it just does its own thing. Now it's gone independent, all the power to them. But to follow them, to me, means we are in the margin of those journals from Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa. For whether we like it or not, what Taylor Francis and UNISA Press and others have done is, it has brought in South African and African scholarship on equal terms with the global north. I think that's my priorities, more than the financial issues, etc. It would be nice to have a good subsidy, but as we know it, subsidies don't last. Therefore, it was the willingness of UNISA Vice Chancellor Bani Pitiana, who was willing to put the money in, and the willingness of Taylor and Francis and with David to put equivalent of it, which led to this growth. For I think we need to be very careful not to be caught up in the latest. We are told now, if we put all our things online, it will be read, etc. It won't happen. It needs marketing, it needs the thing. And the best journal to follow is, of course, the Third World Quarterly, that it has a beginning, truth, Shahid. He has brought it to this level, to the point where we're existing. Therefore, I think we need to put all this in context, in the context of where we are in the global economy and how we become kind of second-class citizen if we don't fight it. I'm not saying it's a dead end. Actually, it's easy to fight those things if we know what we're up to and not to fall to ideological kind of bites which comes. Sorry, it became more than a speech, but I thought I heard all this and I understand all the issues, and I face it as an editor in other journals, not only Taylor Francis, but others. But I think we need to be very careful that we don't have an exit point. We don't have an exit position whereby, we're going to independent. We need to be part of the global knowledge production, and there is not one way of doing it. There are many ways of doing it, and this is one forum.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you. On the right and then in the center.
Thank you so much. I was going to ask some questions about African languages, AU languages, Portuguese, Arabic, Swahili, and so on. But I think the comments from the colleague from the conversation, I think, made me shift a little bit where I was going to, and particularly what you mentioned about the role of research institutes and think tanks. Because I think it is an interesting reflection on how many of our epistemic communities are working almost at times in parallel to one another. And an understanding of control of knowledge, gatekeeping of knowledge, and this identification of what knowledge actually matters. Because if we are talking here is that, and I love the conversation about the anthropology journal, that we need to engage in more conversations. Coming from both sides, having worked in think tanks and research institutes for almost 20 years, and being in an academia now, there's different pros and cons. And I can't really say that if I read a paper from a Q1 journal in my field that would necessarily be better than the things that I read and engage with from a research institute. But I think you ask a very good question there. Who owns that? I think it's less about who owns that, but about what is the purpose of that knowledge. And I think that's where they offer quite drastically. Because to a certain extent, what think tanks are often trying to do is to produce knowledge that is directly relevant to policymakers, and that it doesn't necessarily provide them a final answer, but it generates a certain conversation that is deemed to be important. For me, it's a missed opportunity, particularly in a country like South Africa, where think tanks have a long and rich experiences of producing high quality research, and funny enough that it's usually peer reviewed, that it's paid for the authors, because authors usually are commissioned and paid to do that. And third, there is an attempt and an increasing attempt of producing knowledge beyond just through writing. But that creates a lot of these barriers. I showed once to my supervisor my list of publications, which was around 70 or 80 publications. But perhaps only 2 or 3 of them were in journals, meaning that in that particular context, around 68 of those publications are considered null and void. They are not good enough, even though they're being taught in higher education courses, both at the undergrad and postgrad level, that this is being presented and interacted to policymakers, and we have to show how that actually contributed to particular change. And so to a certain degree, that change that we are talking about democratizing knowledge, it has also to come by the way that we think about the very format of academic journals. And I know what I love of the conversation, that is precisely that. And I think it brings good academics that are thinking in a much faster, direct way. But it still comes a lot with the challenges of being academia completely isolated from policy. Martha and I have been talking for a week about the term BRICS Plus. BRICS expanded next year. It's certainly many academics that are calling BRICS as BRICS Plus. Someone that works directly, that goes to the summits, that engages with the policymakers on a daily basis, that makes me cringe, because there's already a process called BRICS Plus, and it's not the expanded group. And that creates confusion and so on. That for me is a little sign of the need, and it's actually a need for institutions like the ISS, like SIA, like IGD, or any other of the big think tanks, and I'm going to talk specifically on international relations here, to engage much closer to academia, not just by inviting one another to events, and we often do that, but trying to find new ways and vehicles for academics that are wanting to engage more directly with policymakers and to be perhaps at times more in touch with some of those policy processes. And the other way around, to allow those institutes that have a rich knowledge of the ground, because we're talking about getting funding to do field work and so on. If you're doing a project that you're going every 2 months to Goma in the DRC to engage in training, the level of knowledge and content that so many of the think tankers in this country have, it's a really untapped resource that we are not even starting to look into. We certainly don't do, I've worked at the ISS before, I work at SIA now. We certainly don't do that well enough, even within the journals that we have within certain think tanks. But I think we need to be careful, because it creates a certain narrative that only higher education universities and PhD recipients are worth it to engage in certain conversations. And that, for me, is a way that we start changing the way that we communicate research, because we take each other's different comparative advantages and we are reaching different audiences. So that's why, once again, that idea of who owns that knowledge. The knowledge from think tanks is not usually directed to higher education, or I've rarely seen that. And neither is a lot of the journal articles geared towards the policies, certain exceptions. How do we make both talk more to one another? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gustavo. Okay, one more in the middle, and then we'll get some responses.
Okay, hi. Simplistic thinker again. So I want to start with, so I have a few thoughts, curiosities really, coming out of a few of my various identities. So first up, I'm a member of the Professional Editors Guild. And one of the hottest conversations right now on the group is AI. And what does it mean for us as editors? Some people are worried that it will put us out of a job, but I'm not at all, because I'm on that side that thinks AI has so many limitations. But one of the things that came up for me the other day, there was a request. We get requests from time to time from students who want their theses edited. And this student, this one just really had me away. He wanted help with editing an assignment that had been generated for him by AI. And his request was for an editor to humanize it. So, and so my question is, what are the implications of AI for scholarship, right? Just for the ability to ideate, to analyze, to think, and to speak in one's own words. So I'm throwing that out to the panel. So another one I have is, and probably mostly to the representative of that, the East African Journal, Literature and Culture and so on. And you alluded to the speaker online earlier, I think it was Divine, who I think threw out a challenge around there not being enough written about art and culture. So I'm just wondering, I'm curious about how this esteemed body would respond to that challenge. I'm also curious, and particularly, this is especially for the representative of the Security Journal, I'm curious about how many contributions do you get from LGBTQIA plus contributors? Yes. How much stuff do you get? And then lastly, and this is kind of tongue-in-cheek, what's the scope for work for freelance editors from among you? It's serious, but sort of tongue-in-cheek, like.
Thank you so much. I think we'll invite any responses or comments from the panelists.
Thanks. So just on that last question on LGBTQI+, we don't have a metric that measures for that because people aren't asked to declare that when they submit an article, so we would not know. I think unless we had to go and, deep dive into that person's profile and assuming that they were visible with that part of their identity in their online presence. So the simple answer to the question is I don't know.
So I'm sorry, maybe I should rephrase the question and
Sure.
rather ask around LGBTQIA plus issues.
Yeah.
We have published 2 papers on the voting records at the United Nations on what they call SOCI, sexual orientation, gender identities, South Africa's record, and then other African country record. So 2 different authors have submitted papers on those issues. They did not identify one way or the other So, but that was the main issue under discussion. So human rights oriented analysis.
Yeah, so as a topic, I wouldn't say it's something that is prominent that we receive submissions on.
Similarly, with the JCAS, Journal of Contemporary African Studies, so you'd imagine that, you know, we would. We don't receive much submissions from the LGBT community or special issues, at least in the last couple of decade or so. I haven't seen a prominent special issue on that. Sporadic articles do come in, but literally sporadic.
On that, I would have to look up, but we do receive anthropology. Yeah, absolutely, we do receive those journals, but I can't tell you what the percentage is. About freelance editors, yes, the NISC manages our copy editing, and they do hire freelance editors for ASNA journal. Regarding AI, your example is excellent. That's what we do with the students. I just wonder how we don't check all. I mean, it's easy to tell, relatively easy to tell when AI is used in the journal, but like whatever you read, it's pretty bland, it's pretty cliched. But I think we would need some systems which can actually check, like plagiarism was checked now for AI, we do need that. But what I was actually mentioning around the research, I think a very focused, nuanced project around anthropology of AI use in writing would be really interesting, and what it is doing to the publishing landscape broadly, not just like editors or the industry. Just it could be a very big project. It's not my area of expertise or interest, so I'm not the right person to say what it should be, but I think it will be really useful because of the pace at which all this is changing, and especially now that the research article, peer-reviewed research articles are now fed in to train the AI language models. So I really don't know it's not a critique. I would be very reserved about blanket critiques to corporates, because that's just creates aggression rather than understanding. And we don't have enough understanding. And a lot of the TNF, when the Informa signs that agreement with the AI generative models, all those contracts are bound by confidentiality. We can't even look at them properly, fully. So that undermines our ability to understand, let alone the all really sophisticated mathematics that goes behind in generation of these language models. But I think it's already happening. There's history of science, there's anthropology of science, and this kind of anthropology and history of technology would be so useful to better understand where we are. So that's kind of what I was hinting towards.
Oh, I would think you'd take the AI question. No? Okay. Well, I will just give general feedback. There was an interesting question around bridging between policy and so I have not worked on the other end of the spectrum, so I would imagine you'd pick up on that, the conversation, because for me, your journal does create the kind of bridging gap, step, whatever, between academia and the public more generally, right? Well, that's my sense of it, that academics do tend to feel safe where they publish in journals like The Conversation, where your work goes out there to the quote-unquote public and doesn't go through the same kind of what is it? Editing, reviewing, peer review, thank you. So it doesn't go through that process in the same way. It does go through, I'm sure, a process, but it doesn't go through the same process that it does with us. And I'll just anecdotally say this. I submitted a paper for publication to a journal. I will not name names, and my paper was double rejected. And the reason for it wasn't because it was a bad paper. I mean, my thoughts were there. It was the register. And I'm sure had I submitted it to a different place, it probably would have gone through. Anyway, I changed the language. I humanized it now. I made it more academic, and then it was double accepted. So it tells you something, and I think I'm hearing what you were then saying about what kinds of efforts can we make to bridge that gap, between policy, speaking to government, speaking about policy, and then academia. I don't have an answer, unfortunately. On the question of, so two points that I'll speak to. On the question of LGBT, absolutely, we do publish, being literature and being cultural studies. And by cultural studies, it's anything from popular culture. So we do tend to publish quite a few of those. And it's also, as my co-editors have said here, well, not co-editors, but my colleagues have said, it's about the principle, it's about basic human rights, right? So we do publish that, and it's about just putting out the message that we need to put out. So there's space for that and scope for that, and we do receive quite a few of those kinds of articles. With regard to editors, freelance, I would leave that to Janet. I wouldn't know. We basically operate, there are lots of doors and windows we can't cross, so we can, I suppose, if we tried, but different people, doing different things. So I would leave that to Taylor and Francis to answer. Yeah. Do you want to speak? I feel like there's a point there for you too.
Well, yeah, look, we do obviously create that interface. I mean, that's the whole basis of the conversation, which is an idea that started in Australia around 2009, 2010, by saying, well, the universities produce all of this knowledge, have all of this expertise, but it's not accessible to the public. So how about we marry that expertise with some editing experience? I don't want to say journalistic experience, because we do have people who can edit, but are not necessarily coming from a journalism background. But for ease of reference, we do tend to use journalism and sort of academic expertise. So the idea then comes up in Australia, and then obviously it has expanded to other parts of the world, in the US, UK, Canada, Spain, France, and then there's the Conversation Africa, there's the Conversation Brazil. Somebody a couple of years back was trying to launch something in India, but India is a very difficult place to try and launch something like that, because if you are a non-profit, the regulation is quite difficult if you're going to raise money from outside India, for example. So it becomes quite a difficult place to operate. And then there's Indonesia as well. So it has sort of expanded out of that idea, and it has delivered to that idea, or to that ideal, but it could do better, obviously. I mean, there's still quite a lot of improvements to be made, I think, to how you make that expertise and knowledge accessible to the broader public. Well, the one layer, obviously, that you offer is through republication, because you publish articles under the Commons license, which means that your traditional media, by traditional media these days, I also include websites and everything. It's become traditional. So they can reproduce the material so long as they acknowledge the author as the person who wrote the article, and then obviously tip a little kind of hat to the conversation as well. So there is an element of that. We do know from some of the anecdotal evidence we collect from authors that policymakers do look at articles. What impact that has on policy making, we don't know, whether they would then go and on the basis of what they have read and do anything about policy. unless maybe there's a piece of legislation that one can track, or a policy document that you can track and see where it started, and come to some conclusion whether its source was a study done by an author who then wrote about it, and then that triggered some sort of policy development. It's interestingly, it's an issue. I don't know to what extent researchers in South Africa look at policy kind of gestation. So if suddenly there's a policy that has come up, well, how did it get into the agenda of a minister, for example, to drive a particular policy? Because that in itself, I think, would make an interesting study. Yes, a governing party has a conference, it passes certain resolutions, so that will often be why certain policies come about, but there are other ways in which policies come about. Some of them are just championed by a senior civil servant who has a kind of either has been lobbied by important lobby groups, or has an interest in a particular issue, because that happens too, where somebody who's interested in a particular subject and has influence can drive it, and you can't identify any stakeholder or any public demand for that policy, but there was somebody in government who's interested in the issue, and he drove that policy, and it becomes government policy. Yeah. So it will be interesting to see if there are any studies done looking at policy gestation and how it evolves through government.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to the policy discussion, because what I find with the submissions we get is actually this sort of ghost of the policy framework. It seems like a lot of submissions that come from the continent, people, we seem to be for me, invested in that framework. And so for me, what's really, I think, what would be important, what's important is the knowledge production, is the theoretical, which I think I mentioned the issue, issues of energy racism. I think where we're at right now, a lot of Western thought, philosophy has exhausted its intellectualization. And I really do believe in the idea of Africa being a prelude to the future, that there are we have so many layers of everything going on all at the same time. Particularly Johannesburg, being located in a place like Johannesburg, where we sit in a space full of contradictions and paradoxes, that we're at the heart of actually producing theories that are for the world, So for me, that's the concern. It's the theoretical concern, that we sit in spaces where we actually can contribute to the world theoretically, and you're not seeing these things come out from all points, LGBTQ, from kind of all subject areas. Potentially we could be, I think, contributing. And I see these journals, these spaces, as such a critical intellectual space to do that. But it goes back to what you're saying, or what is being said earlier, of they're not allowing that slow thinking. They're not allowing that development, that sort of, theoretical construction. You produce something, this year, next year, it's developing, et cetera, et cetera. So these journals, I like your provocation of can we offer that space? Because I think we do have something to offer as the continent, particularly where we are globally, where we seem to, I think, the West, there seems to be some kind of a cul-de-sac. We need newness, we need a new imagination, a new way of imagining, and it's not my phrase, it's a phrase by Francois Viget, a Black consciousness scholar, who talks about, of Africa being a prelude to the future. that there's certain formations which are about to happen, which happen in the margins and have already happened in Africa. So, you know, yeah.
I think just to pick up on what you've said, Prof. I think for me, without repeating anything that my colleagues have already said, is I've been really concerned about the corporate motive to knowledge production. And I think we've seen dangerous precedents in the past few years, how one annoyed billionaire can lead to erasure of years and years of works by scholars. The new frame is a perfect example of a recent precedent. But what we are also seeing now is the move to the digital also means that, you know, so much of our work is actually not protected, and that, you know, with one little click, someone high up at TNF can literally delete years and years and years of scholarship. So I think for me, I'm really worried about this corporate motive that we see in the past 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Pardon?
SIRE retains our copyright.
Sorry.
There are real protections there. That just can't happen.
Yeah.
No, I'm very aware.
Because there are things like locks
Yes.
and clocks, which is all about the
Yeah.
deep archives,
Yeah.
which we'll have access to. It's nothing to do with corporate. That's part of the process.
I think you should have let me finish, because I'm very aware of what you are saying. But I'm giving you practical examples. So take an example. Go to an article from 5 years ago. Check which links are still working there. So we have this phenomenon of dead links. So even if you do, so what I'm saying here is not necessarily, you can retain your copyright, yes, but not every person has that access. So the point I'm trying to drive across around the corporatization of knowledge production is that if we're moving into an online platform only, and you know, you might have copyright for yourselves, but not every journal does. So our knowledge, what I'm trying to stress is that there is a great danger in all of us when we have corporates in many ways controlling the production of knowledge. And that's what I was trying to raise an alarm of, because there have been precedents, as I've said, in the past few years, where one annoyed billionaire led to the erasure of so many years and years of scholarship by particularly black feminist scholars who were writing for those platforms.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of our time, and I know the topic of time has been explored in various dimensions in this panel. And yes, I think we are in a time of seismic change, and it's discombobulating and disorienting, and I think AI has obviously been a big theme, concerns about the digital environment. Perhaps I could just say in brief that I know there have been a few references to AI partnerships that Taylor and Francis has entered into. They've been undertaken specifically for the purpose of protection of intellectual property and providing a legal framework for training of AI. AI is here to stay. I mean, it's here, it's part of us. It's taken most of us somewhat by surprise at the rate of acceleration, and we have to in some way engage. Otherwise, we're going to all be undone. So these partnerships are actually provide guardrails for big tech. So there are very strict rules around what can be used, how it's done. It's not about generating new content out of the research per se, but it's about improving the understanding, if I can, of these LLMs, these large language models, so that they have less bias. If you don't get African content into large language models, multiple voices across fields, across areas of expertise, our students, the young people, the general public are turning to LLMs for everything. I've heard even they're surpassing Google. They're going to LLMs to tell them how to, get to some destination they want to, everyone's turning to them, whether we like it or not. So we have to improve the basis on which these LLMs operate. And I think time has been a big issue because we've had to move fast, and it's very difficult to consult literally thousands of partners, of authors, millions probably of authors. So, all this has all been done within standard licensing and contractual arrangements we have with scholars and partners. Yes, but I think this whole point around seismic change and this time we're living in is radical, is frightening, and I think, as we've also heard from someone like Jabulani, if we can marshal AI and other tech in a positive way, then there are some opportunities. So yes, I think I elaborated a bit more than I had planned, but I think it's so good just to have conversations where we do engage, and thank you. This was meant to be provocative, and it's given us a lot to collectively take away. And I'm just going to check with the organizers how we're doing on our very much in the human time-oriented space we're operating, and how we're doing. Are we? We're wrapping it up. Yes, and we've got, for those who are able to come to the next phase of our engagement at Gallery MOMO, we've got some drinks and canapes and very much human-centered interaction. So please, and art, which is absolutely. And yes, so we'll be an art walkabout, talk about what's being exhibited at Gallery MOMO and more general developments within the art scene, and a chance just to decompress after a very full and stimulating day. Thank you. Is anyone else want to close off, or shall we leave it there and...
Thank you all for coming. I really would like to encourage everyone to come to MOMO. I think it's on the website how to get there. There will be an incredible painting by South African artists. Hopefully he'll give us a bit of a tour, a bit of a drink, and relax after a long day. This project started about a year ago. It's been an incredible success in the sense that we are able to reflect back on South Africa. And for someone who's not a South African but an Ethiopian, but involved in South Africa for the last 35, 40 years, one sees hope that there is engagement with South Africa, with the continent. And it is, for me, it's been an incredible experience. I would like to thank David Green for pulling the whole thing together, Shahid for giving us support and being there all the time, UNISA Press, Skotaville, and Routledge Books and Journal. I think more than the books, Janet has been not only put this panel together, but she's been supportive throughout our activities. Watch out for the books coming out. They'll be coming in different phases. They will be published by the international publishing will be done by Routledge. The South African will be done by Skotaville and UNISA Press. They'll be available both as e-books, etc. Just one thing I want to mention about books, how the nature of books is changing. I think it's what happened with journals become the most lucrative business with all your reservation. But books are actually approaching it that way. Now you can get it because it's on you can get a chapter, you can get a section of it, you can use it for assignment. We need to think about, unfortunately, this is really led by the US. A book which is reviewed in the New York Times on Sunday would become incredibly successful because every librarian in the US university and others, we just take it without reading what's been written and for people. But things are changing. Actually, technology in that sense is helping us. We can actually, change it. I'll give you an example. I think there is a sister from West Indies. It used to be the case where if you are a good athlete, you move, Jamaican for instance, you move to Canada or to the US to be successful. Those days are gone now. Most Jamaican athletes are staying there and they're running because the big companies are basically sponsoring them there in Jamaica, and that has become a brand. I think we need to think about our publishing like that. I think, how can we be involved? How can we be part of the knowledge production instead, of that system instead of consumption? I think we are seen as consumer. There are all kinds of problems, but actually, South Africa at least in the last 40 years, from being isolated, has become the leading academic publishing house and the leading publishers, both books and others. I think that's a good lesson for the rest of the continent. So thank you very much for coming, and do join us. Oh, I forgot my boss, my new boss. Beg pardon? God, see, I should have bet. Betty is much more organized than me. UJ, they didn't know what they were getting from me. They didn't have any clue when I suggested. But both the deputy dean and the director of sociological, what do they call themselves? I think change it to Steve Biko Center would be easier. They give me a blank check, and I'm really enjoy. Last week she saved us. Odysseus from MOMO, pull it together. I didn't even think about these folks. If it were not for them, today would not be possible. Anybody I missed? And for me, it was a good thing that I reconnected with Nomboniso. I found out that actually we know each other, some of the people in the journals. It's been a great get-together. Heta single-handedly carried UNISA, despite all kinds of problems, and I really thank you. Of course, my brother here, Sadet, just to give you some idea, Sadet was started when I was the director of UNISA Press. And I think the chairman, what was his name? He's gone to heaven, I think. He's Muslim. I don't know whether he go to heaven or heaven. But Aesop basically was very unpleased with the first issue, and he told Sadet, give it to the gay guy. Let him do it. For it came to UNISA, it's been a success. It's incredible work, Pan-Africanist work. And Safiso has been good. He's been, he's not only done a great job carrying it after Aesop and other people have passed away, and he's still carrying it on with other publishing houses. Again, thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Join us at MOMO.